I am 68 years old, and today my only son struck me across the face just because I asked his wife not to smoke right next to me. He called me a stinking old man and told me to shut my mouth. She just laughed, commenting that it was about time someone put me in my place. I felt my glasses shattered, and as I picked up the shards of glass from the floor with trembling hands, I realized something very simple. For 15 years, I endured humiliations because I believed that was what you called family. For 15 years, I kept quiet about what I actually had. For 15 years, my son didn't even suspect what I truly possessed or who had acted as a real father to him all that time. But 15 minutes after that blow, I made a phone call and everything changed forever. My son was convinced I was a helpless old man hanging around his neck. He was wrong. Now let's get back to the story. The kitchen smelled of homemade chicken broth and pan-seared steaks because Elias Thistleton had been cooking since the early hours of the morning. Just as he had done every day for 15 years, he stood at the sink, washing dishes and looking out the window at the November yard where the wind dragged the last yellow leaves across the wet asphalt. He thought about how winter would soon arrive, and it would be time to pull the heavy coats down from the top of the closet again. The water was very hot, almost scalding, but he liked it that way because the heat soothed his aging hands, which had been aching more and more at night lately. Behind him, he heard the click of a lighter, and Elias smelled the cigarette smoke even before he turned around. Brianna, his daughter-in-law, was sitting at the kitchen table with one leg crossed over the other, smoking and flicking ash directly into her half-finished cup of tea. She was 39 years old and possessed a cold beauty, the kind that doesn't provide warmth, but rather cuts deep. She had never tried to hide how she felt about her father-in-law. To her, Elias was like an old piece of furniture, something outdated and useless that should have been put out on the curb long ago. Elias felt his chest tighten. Asthma had plagued him for 15 years, ever since the passing of his wife, Loretta. The doctors told him it was partly psychosomatic, that sometimes grief settles in the lungs and refuses to let you breathe. He pulled his inhaler from his pocket, showed it to Brianna, and spoke in the softest voice he could manage, trying not to sound demanding or accusatory. "Brianna, please, could you smoke on the porch? My asthma is acting up. It's really hard for me to breathe when there's smoke around. I'm not trying to nag. I'm just asking for a favor." Brianna didn't even turn her head toward him. She took a deeper drag, exhaled the smoke toward the ceiling, and replied with that specific tone of absolute contempt Elias had been hearing for years. "This is my kitchen, too. If you don't like it, you can leave." Elias wanted to talk back. He wanted to remind her that it wasn't exactly like that, that legally the kitchen and the entire house belonged to him. But he stayed silent as he always did. He turned back to the sink and kept washing dishes, trying to breathe shallowly so he wouldn't cough, trying to be invisible. At that moment, Dante, his son, his only son, his own flesh and blood, the boy he had raised, educated, and supported walked into the kitchen. And Dante was 42 years old and worked as a manager at a construction firm. In recent years, then he reminded Elias more and more of someone carrying a heavy burden on his shoulders, but refusing to admit it existed. That morning, Dante had already woken up in a foul mood. There were problems at work. The boss was leaning on him. Brianna was demanding a new car, and life in general seemed deeply unfair to him. Dante caught his father's last words and stopped her in the doorway. His face twisted into a look Elias knew all too well, that scowl of irritation that so easily turned into rage. "Are you at it again?" Dante asked, his voice laced with so much venom that Elias instinctively hunched his shoulders. "Always the asthma. Drama. Every single day. Brianna has the right to smoke in her own home." "Son, I only asked her to," Elias started, but he didn't get to finish the sentence. Something snapped inside Dante like a blown fuse. He stepped toward his father, his face contorted. Elias saw the scene as if in slow motion, his son's hand rising, the fist clenching, the blow approaching. He didn't have time to move away or even raise his hands to protect himself. "Shut up. You smelled worse than the cigarettes. Do you have any idea how sick we all are of you?" The punch hit his cheek with dry, brutal force. Elias was thrown backward. His hip hit the edge of the sink and he slumped to the floor. His glasses went flying, striking the table leg, and the lenses shattered across the tile with a soft tinkling sound. The pain in his face was sharp and intense, but even more, More piercing was another pain, one that stabbed deep inside, where the heart is supposed to be. Brianna laughed. It wasn't just a smirk of superiority. She actually laughed out loud, throwing her head back, and said with evident pleasure, "It was about time someone put you in your place. How long were we supposed to put up with your whining?" Elias lay on the cold floor, staring at the ceiling. He was 68 years old. He had raised that boy who was now standing over him with clenched fists. He had spent sleepless nights when Dante was sick as a child. He had worked 2 jobs to put him through college. He had sold his country house to help him with the down payment on his first car. And now that boy, his son, his blood stood there without even thinking of reaching out a hand to help him up. Dante was breathing hard, and slowly the realization of what he had just done began to show on his face. But instead of regret, something else appeared, something like self-justification. He kept telling himself he was right, that it was his father's fault, that the old man had pushed him to the limit with his eternal victimhood. "Get up," Dante grunted, turning away. "Stop the act." Elias pushed himself up slowly. Then he stood up just as slowly. His knees were shaking, but he forced himself to stand tall. He leaned over and began picking up the remains of his glasses, placing them carefully in his palm as if they were something precious, something that could still be repaired. Brianna stubbed her cigarette out in her teacup, stood up, and said, with a smile, "Come on, Dante, let him clean up. At least he's useful for something." They left the kitchen, and Elias was left alone. He stood motionless for a few seconds, holding the broken glass in his hand and staring at the door through which his son and daughter-in-law had disappeared. Something changed inside him at that moment. Something shifted and clicked into place, like an audible snap. He had been enduring this for 15 years, convincing himself it was normal, that all families had problems, that his son was just tired from work, that Brianna simply didn't understand him. For 15 years, he had lied to himself. But now, standing in that kitchen with a swollen face and shattered glasses, Elias finally saw the truth. This wasn't a family. It never had been. It was something else, something ugly and cruel that he only called family because he was terrified of being alone. He went to his room, a tiny space at the end of the hall that they had assigned to him when he moved in after Loretta's death. 15 years ago, it was the smallest room in the house, an old storage closet they had barely converted into something resembling a bedroom. It held a narrow bed, an old dresser, and a nightstand with a lamp. On the wall hung a single photo of Loretta, his late wife, who looked at him with a soft smile, as if she wanted to tell him something important. Elias sat on the bed and just stayed there, staring at the wall. He felt his cheek throbbing and could tell a bruise was forming. "Everyone will see it tomorrow," he thought distantly. The neighbors would see it and ask questions. He would have to lie and say he fell as usual. Then he remembered something. A business card he had received 3 months earlier from a young notary who had come to the building regarding a neighbor's inheritance. That notary, a serious woman in her late 30s, had stayed to talk to him a bit longer than necessary, and Elias, without really knowing why, had told her more than he should have. He told her about his son, who would go weeks without speaking to him, and about his daughter Una, who told him he was a burden. He told her how he felt like a stranger in his own home. The notary had listened intently and given him her card. "If you ever want to get your affairs in order, call me," she had said. "Sometimes tidying up your documents helps tidy up your life." Elias pulled that card from the nightstand drawer, where it had sat all those months, and looked at it with his nearsighted eyes. Without his glasses, the letters were a blur, but he already knew the number by heart. He had been looking at it every night before bed for weeks, thinking that one day he would call. That day had arrived. He took out his old flip phone, the one Dante called a museum piece, and always told him to throw away, and dialed the number. The ringtone seemed too loud in the silence of the room. "Kensington and Associates." "Good morning," a woman's voice answered. "Good morning," Elias said. His own voice sounded strange to him, calm and firm, as if it belonged to someone else. "This is Elias Thistleton. You gave me a card about 3 months ago. Do you remember?" There was a brief pause, and the tone on the other end became warmer. "Of course I remember. Mr. Thistleton, are you ready?" Elias looked at Loretta's photo on the wall. She was still smiling at him, and it seemed to him that she was nodding her head. "Yes," he replied. "I'm ready. Could you come today, right now, if possible?" He gave her the address, which she already knew, and hung up. Then he lay back on the pillow and closed his eyes. His heart was beating too fast and he felt pressure in his chest. But it wasn't the asthma, it was something else. Something very much like the feeling of liberation. For the first time in 15 years, Elias felt like his life was in his own hands. He stayed like that for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the house from the living room. The voices of Dante and Brianna reached him. They were watching television, talking about something and laughing. They had already forgotten what happened in the kitchen. To them, it had been nothing more than an episode, an unimportant scene. They didn't know that this episode had changed everything. Elias got up from the bed and went to the closet. On the top shelf, behind several old sweaters, was a box. He took it down and opened it. Inside were documents. Many documents he had been keeping for years without showing them to anyone. Deeds, lease agreements, bank statements, the history of his true life. The part of his life his son knew absolutely nothing about. He spread the documents out on the bed and began reviewing them, checking that everything was in order. The deed to the house they were living in this very house, bore his name. He had never transferred it to Dante. Even though he had promised 2 years ago, something had held him back. A kind of inner voice, whispering, "Wait, don't rush. First, see what kind of man your son becomes." Now he saw it clearly. There were also the deeds to 2 other apartments in the city center that Elias had been renting out through an agency for years. The rent went into an account in his name, an account Dante knew nothing about. He didn't know because he never asked. He was never interested in how his father lived, if he had money, if he needed help. Dante was convinced his father was surviving on a meager social security check and was entirely dependent on him. That certainty made him arrogant and cruel because he was convinced Elias had nowhere else to go. Poor old man without a dime. Where's he going to go? Dante thought he was wrong. Suddenly a sharp pain pierced his chest and Elias clutched his heart. It was a strong, stabbing pain unlike anything he had felt before. He tried to inhale, but the air wouldn't enter his lungs. Black spots clouded his vision, and he realized he was falling, but he couldn't do anything to stop it. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Loretta's face in the photograph on the wall. She was still smiling. The crash of the fall echoed throughout the house, and for a few seconds the house went silent. Then from the living room, Dante's irritated voice was heard. What was that now? He dropped something again. Brianna let out a laugh. Maybe he finally tripped over his own feet. Ignore him, he'll manage. But the noise didn't repeat, and no sound came from the room. Dante waited 1 more minute and grudgingly got up from the sofa. "I'll go look," he muttered. "I don't want him breaking anything important." He walked down the hall to his father's room, pushed the door open, and saw Elias lying on the floor, unconscious. Documents were scattered around him, and his face held a strange expression, a mix of pain and relief. Dante's first reaction was irritation. Another performance, he thought, another attempt to get attention. But he quickly noticed that his father's chest wasn't moving. Or it was moving so little it was barely noticeable, and something cold stirred inside him. "Dad," he called cautiously. "Dad, what are you doing?" There was no answer. Dante stood in the doorway, looking at his father's motionless body. Somewhere, very deep down, a feeling that had been dormant for years began to wake up. He forced himself to step forward, then another, and knelt beside Elias. His hands were shaking when he touched his shoulder. That trembling was unfamiliar. To him, Dante hadn't felt fear or powerlessness in years. "Dad," he called again, his voice now raspy. "Dad, can you hear me? Open your eyes." Elias didn't react. His chest barely rose and fell, and that was the only sign he was still alive. Dante pressed 2 fingers to his father's neck, trying to find a pulse like he'd seen in movies, but he didn't know if what he felt was Elias's heart or his own, which was thundering in his ears. "Call 911, he roared toward Brianna, who was still standing in the doorway. "What are you just standing there for? Hurry." Brianna jumped at his tone, pulled out her phone, and started dialing. Her fingers tapped the numbers, while Dante remained sitting on the floor next to his father, looking at his motionless face and feeling something dark rising inside him, something suffocating. It wasn't just fear for Elias's life, or at least not only that, it was a different fear of what would come after, of the consequences, of the responsibility. Emergency services. "Good morning. There's a gentleman here who's collapsed," Brianna said in a quick, efficient voice. An older man, 68 years old, lying on the floor unconscious. "Yes, he's breathing. The address is 14 Pendleton Street, Apartment 73. While they waited for the ambulance, Dante sat by his father's body and for the first time in many years really looked at him. Elias had aged a lot in the 15 years he had been living with them. His hair was almost white and thin. His skin sagged on his cheeks and under his chin, and his hands were covered in age spots. When did he get so old? Dante thought. When did that tall, strong man who used to carry me on his shoulders all over the park turn into this thin, trembling old man who's always complaining about his health? His gaze fell on the papers scattered near Elias, and almost without thinking, he leaned toward them. But at that moment, the doorbell rang. "It's the paramedics," Brianna said, and went to open it. Dante stood up quickly, brushed off his knees, and with an instinctive movement, kicked several documents under the bed. He didn't even know why he was doing it. He just felt an impulse screaming that those papers should be kept away from prying eyes. The paramedics entered the room, a young man with a medical bag and a woman in her late 50s with a tired but attentive face. The woman immediately knelt beside Elias to examine him while the young man opened the bag and pulled out equipment. "Heart attack," the doctor said after a minute, addressing her partner. "His blood pressure is dropping. Let's get an EKG on him now." Dante leaned against the wall, watching what they were doing, feeling out of place in that tiny room. Brianna stayed in the hallway and he could hear her on the phone with someone, probably a friend, gossiping about what was happening. Suddenly, the doctor raised her head and looked directly at him. Her gaze was sharp, evaluative, and under that scrutiny, Dante felt uncomfortable. "Your father?" she asked. It wasn't exactly a question. "Yes," he replied. "Elias Thistleton, 68. He has asthma. He uses an inhaler." The doctor nodded, but continued to look at him with the same focus. "And that bruise on his face and the wound on his temple." Dante's mouth felt dry. He swallowed hard and blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "He fell," he said. "I guess when he got dizzy, I just found him on the floor." The doctor didn't answer him, but something in her gaze changed. She leaned back over Elias and continued working. Dante, however, saw how she paused for a second to very carefully examine the hematoma, feeling the cheek and the temple. At that moment, Elias groaned and opened his eyes. His gaze was cloudy, disoriented. He didn't seem to understand where he was or what was happening. He tried to sit up, but the doctor held him gently. "Stay still," she told him. "You lost consciousness. We're with the ambulance. We're going to see what happened to you." Elias blinked several times, and slowly his gaze cleared. He looked at the doctor, then at the young man with the equipment, and finally at Dante, who was still leaning against the wall. When his eyes met his son's, Elias didn't look away or close his eyes. He looked at him directly with a calm that Dante had never seen before. "How do you feel?" the doctor asked. "Can you tell me what happened?" Elias looked at her and remained silent for a few seconds, as if carefully weighing his answer. "I had a pain in my heart," he finally said. "I got nervous and fell." The doctor leaned a little closer to him and lowered her voice, though Dante managed to catch every word. "Mr. Thistleton, that bruise on your cheek isn't from a fall. I've been a doctor for 30 years, and I know very well what a punch looks like. Someone hit you." The silence became thick, almost tangible. Dante felt his heart beating in his throat and wanted to run out of there. To be anywhere else but in that room, charged with expectation. Elias looked at his son for a long time intently, as if seeing him for the first time in his life. Then he looked back at the doctor. "I fell," he repeated in a low but firm voice. "I tripped on the threshold and fell." The doctor held his gaze for a few more seconds. "Are you sure?" Elias nodded. "Sure." Dante exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath the whole time. His father had just covered for him. The same father he had punched in the face 15 minutes earlier had just lied to protect him. He should have felt gratitude, but what he felt was something very strange, a mixture of shame and irritation, as if he had been unmasked. The doctor pulled a card from her pocket and left it on the nightstand. "This is my personal card," she said to Elias. "I'm Dr. Nia Sterling. If you need help, and any kind of help, call me. I mean it." Elias looked at the card, then at the doctor, and a slight smile touched his lips. "Thank you, Dr. Sterling. I'll call you." The next half hour was filled with medical procedures. Aided an EKG, took his blood pressure several times, and gave him some pills under his tongue. The young man asked him what medications he took, what chronic illnesses he had, and if he was allergic to anything. Elias answered with patience and detail, and Dante listened in surprise. discovering that he didn't know even half of what his father was telling them. He didn't know his father had high blood pressure. For 5 years, he didn't know he took pills every morning. He didn't know he had stomach problems and couldn't eat anything fried. He had been living wall to wall with this man for years and knew practically nothing about him. Finally, the doctor announced that his condition had stabilized and hospitalization wasn't necessary, but he needed absolute rest for at least a week, followed by a mandatory visit to a cardiologist. "Is there someone who can take care of him?" she asked, looking at Dante, of course. He replied too quickly, "My wife and I live here." The doctor again fixed him with that gaze that made Dante feel like a child caught in a lie. "Fine," she said at last. "Total rest. No worries, no stress." She emphasized those last words in such a way that even Dante got the message. The paramedics packed their things and left. The house went silent. Brianna poked her head through the door. "So, is he going to live?" she asked with a smirk. "For a moment there, I thought I'd have to start planning a funeral." Dante winced, as if she had slapped him. "Shut up," he snapped. "Just shut up." Brianna raised her eyebrows in surprise, but didn't respond, and went back to the living room. Dante stood in the hallway between his father's room and the living room, not knowing where to go or what to do. He felt he had to go in and talk to Elias, say something, maybe even apologize. But what was he going to say? "Sorry for hitting you. Sorry for calling you a stinking old man." The words were stuck in his throat. In the end, he turned around and went back to the living room, to Brianna, to the television, to that comfortable life where one didn't have to think too much or ask anyone for forgiveness. Elias lay in his bed listening to his son's footsteps, fading away. He wasn't surprised that Dante didn't come in to see him. He didn't particularly hurt. 15 years was enough to learn not to expect affection, care, or even basic manners from his son. He turned his head and looked at the nightstand. Next to the doctor's card was the other one, the one from the notary, Jada Kensington. Elias remembered he had called her before collapsing. She had said she would come as soon as possible. She would probably be arriving soon. He sat up slowly, overcoming the weakness and slight dizziness remaining from the heart attack. The documents he had scattered before the attack were now partly on the floor and partly on the bed. He began picking them up, making sure everything was still there. The deed to the house where they lived, the deeds to the 2 downtown apartments, the lease agreements, the bank statement, everything was in order. All of his real life, the one he had kept hidden from his son and daughter-in-law, remained intact. Elias looked at Loretta's photo on the wall. "I should have done this a long time ago," he murmured, speaking to her. "You always said I was too soft, that Dante had climbed all over me. You were right." Loretta smiled at him from the photograph, and he seemed to see a spark of approval in her eyes. From the living room, the voices of Brianna talking to Dante reached him. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was familiar. Complaints, reproaches, demands. She had always been complaining and demanding something from the very day she joined the family. Elias remembered the first time he saw her 20 years ago. Dante, then 22 and a recent college graduate, came home with a very beautiful girl. With a cold gaze, Loretta had read her instantly. She saw what he was unable to see, blinded by infatuation. "That girl is going to be a disaster for our family," she had told him. Back then, Elias hadn't listened. He believed his son's love was sacred and that he shouldn't interfere. Now, he understood that Loretta had been right, as she almost always was. The doorbell rang, and Elias heard Dante go to open it. Voices in the entryway, surprised, tense, then footsteps down the hall. "Dad," Dante's voice, came from the bedroom door. "Some lawyers are here to see you." Elias placed the documents in a folder, stood up, and smoothed his clothes. His legs were a bit shaky, but he forced himself to stand straight. It was important to appear strong and show that he was in control of the situation. "Let them in," he replied, "and you come in, too. This concerns you." The notary, Jada Kensington, was exactly as Elias remembered her, a tall woman with a straight back and very attentive grey eyes that seemed to see right through people. She wore an impeccable navy blue suit. Her hair was pulled back in a bun, and she gave off that sense of firm calm, possessed by people accustomed to handling other people's secrets and other people's money. Behind her came a young man in his 30s with a leather portfolio. Her assistant, Mr. Thistleton, she greeted, entering the small room and taking a quick, evaluative look. "I came as soon as I could. He told me it was urgent." "Yes," Elias replied, pointing to the only chair in the room. "Please sit down." The conversation is going to be long. Dante stood in the doorway, looking from his father to the notary without understanding a thing. He was clearly unsettled, and that bewilderment made him uneasy. Over the last 15 years, he had grown accustomed to his father being as predictable as an old clock. He always knew what to expect from him, and suddenly everything had gone off script. Dad, what's going on? He tried to keep his voice steady. Why do you need a lawyer when you almost died just now? Elias looked at him, and in that look there was no anger or resentment, only the deep exhaustion of someone who has carried too much weight for too long and finally decides to let it go. Precisely because of that, son, he answered. But I almost died. That made me realize something. Life ends at any moment, and I want to get my affairs in order. Come in and listen. It will interest you. Dante walked in slowly and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest. That pose was intended to convey confidence, but it only revealed his nervousness. Brianna appeared behind him, poking her head in with curiosity, and Elias invited her in as well. You can listen to Brianna. This involves both of you. The notary took her seat and opened the folder she had brought. The young assistant stood by, ready to take notes or hand over documents when needed. Mr. Jada began in a professional tone. 3 months ago, you mentioned you wanted to organize your estate affairs. I have prepared all the necessary documents based on the information you gave me then. But before we proceed, I must confirm that your decision is final. Elias nodded. Final and irrevocable. Dante moved restlessly. What decision? What are you talking about, Dad? Explain exactly what's happening. Elias looked at him for a few seconds in silence, observing this 42-year-old man, his only son, and trying to find in him the child who once ran into his arms, shouting, "Daddy! Daddy!" and laughing with joy. But that child was gone. In his place was a stranger with a hard face and a cold gaze, the same one who 2 hours earlier had punched him in the face and called him a stinking old man. I'll explain now, he finally said. And sit down. This won't be easy to hear. Since there was nowhere to sit, Dante stayed, leaned against the wall. Brianna pressed close to him, putting a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of silent support. The notary pulled out the first document and laid it on the bed in front of Elias. Let's start with the main item, she said. The deed of ownership for the house at 14 Pendleton Street, apartment 73. That is this house we are in right now. Dante smiled in relief. Finally, he exclaimed. It's about time. I thought you'd never decide. You should have put it in my name years ago. The notary looked up and regarded him with a neutral expression. I don't think you understand, Mr. Dante. This is your father's deed. The house belongs to Mr. Elias. It always has, and it still does. The smile slowly faded from Dante's face. What do you mean it still does? He stammered. Dad promised to transfer it 10 years ago, and we agreed on that. Elias shook his head. I promised you. Yes, and I intended to do it, but there was always something that held me back, an internal feeling I couldn't explain. Now I know what it was. I was waiting. I wanted to see what kind of man you would become. Dante turned pale. His crossed hands tightened over his chest. And what does that mean? He asked in a thin voice. That now you've decided to punish me for what happened in the kitchen. Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked at him for a long time, as if wanting to etch every feature of his face into his memory, as if it were the last time he would see him. For what happened in the kitchen, he repeated slowly. Is that what you call it? You hit me, Dante? You slapped your father and you called me a stinking old man and your wife laughed. Brianna flinched as if she had been slapped herself, but she said nothing. Her eyes narrowed and she looked at her father-in-law with ill-disguised hatred. I lost my cool. Dante gritted his teeth. I was wrong. I know that. But it's not like you. You need to put on this whole circus with lawyers in the house. The notary cleared her throat discreetly. If I may, I will continue, she said. There is still much to review. She pulled out 2 more documents and placed them on the bed next to the first one. Deed of ownership for an apartment on Broad Street, number 8, apartment 42, 2 bedrooms, 780 feet, and a deed for an apartment on Liberty Boulevard, number 22, apartment 115, 3 bedrooms, 980 feet. Both properties also belong to Mr. Elias Thistleton. The silence that followed those words was deafening. Dante stood motionless, his face shifting from bewilderment to shock and back to bewilderment. Brianna opened her mouth, but no sound came out. But Dante finally managed to articulate, What apartments? Where did they come from? Elias crossed his hands over his knees and spoke calmly as if commenting on the weather. The first apartment, the one on Broad Street, I bought 30 years ago. When you were still in grade school, your mother and I saved for years. We wanted you to have something of your own when you grew up. Then we bought the one on Liberty Boulevard about 20 years ago. I've had both apartments rented out all this time. The money went into a special account that you knew nothing about. And why? Dante whispered. Why did you never say anything? Did you ever ask Elias's counterart? And for the first time, a hint of bitterness crept into his voice. In these 15 years, did you ever ask how I was living? If I had money for medicine? If I needed anything? Dante didn't answer. His silence spoke for itself. Elias continued. You were certain I was a poor old man hanging around your neck, living off a miserable social security check and entirely dependent on you. That idea made you arrogant. You thought I had nowhere to go, that I would put up with anything because I had no other choice. He paused and looked him in the eye. But I do have a choice, Dante. I always had. I just didn't want to use it because I believed family was above money, above pride, above everything. I was wrong. Brianna finally recovered her voice, stepping forward, trembling with rage. There has to be some mistake, she spat. Where would you get the money for 2 downtown apartments? You were just a low-paid engineer your whole life. Elias turned to her and offered a slight smile. A simple engineer, he repeated. Yes, I was an engineer. But I also secured several patents for my inventions back when the industry still paid well for good ideas. I sold licenses to several companies. With that money, I bought the apartments, and there was plenty left over. The notary pulled out a bank statement and placed it on top of the other documents. The current balance of Mr. Thistleton's account, she read in a neutral tone, is approximately $53,000, plus monthly income of about $1,300 from the rent of the 2 apartments. Brianna turned so pale she looked ready to faint. She grabbed Dante's arm for support, but Dante wasn't much better. Almost $53,000, he murmured, and 2 apartments downtown. Dad, why were you living in this tiny room? Why were you putting up with all of this? Elias stood up. He moved slowly, still weakened by the heart attack, but he stood straight, and in his posture, something new had appeared. A dignity he had been hiding for years. Because I wanted to be near my family, he answered. Because after your mother died, the house felt enormous and empty. I thought I'd be better off near my son. I believed you loved me, Dante, that you just found it hard to show it like many men do. I made excuses for every sharp word, every look of contempt, every lack of respect. He walked to the window and looked at the grey November yard. I paid for everything in this house, he continued without turning round. Did you think it was your salary? No. Every month I left enveloped with cash in your room for food, utilities, repairs. You thought you were the one earning it all, but it was my money. That's not true, Brianna protested, though her voice lacked conviction. Dante earns good money. Dante earns well, Elias admitted, but not well enough to maintain the lifestyle. Both lead a new car every 3 years, vacations abroad every summer, expensive clothes, restaurants, whims. Where did you think it was all coming from? He turned back to her. I know you've never liked me, Brianna. I know you always saw me as a burden and dreamed of getting me out of the way. I've heard your conversations about putting me in a nursing home. I've heard you call me old, useless, and stinking. I've heard it all. Brianna stepped back as if the words had physically hurt her, and I endured it. I'd finished. I endured it for my son, for the idea of family, for the hope that one day things would change. To date, that hope died. The notary observed him intently. Mr. Thistleton, she intervened softly. If you wish, we can leave this for another day. After today's events, it would be best if you rested. Elias shook his head decisively. No, he said firmly. Today, now. I've waited long enough. He turned to Dante and Brianna. I'm going to sell this house, he announced. There's already a buyer. The documents are ready. Only the signature is missing. You will have 30 days to find another place and move out. What? Brianna whispered. You can't do that. This is our home. We've lived here for 15 years. This is my home, Elias corrected calmly. It has always been mine, and I can do with it whatever I wish. Dante remained silent, his face devastated by a mix of rage, fear, shame, and despair. Where are we going to go? He finally asked in a hollow voice. We don't have the money for another house. We can't rent anything in this neighborhood. "That is no longer my problem," Elias replied. There was no cruelty in his tone, only exhaustion. "For 15 years, I solved your problems. Now you will have to solve your own." He looked at the notary and nodded. "Let's sign," he said. "I want this closed today." Jada spread the documents on the small table where Elias usually read at night. The assistant pulled out a blue ink pen and held it ready. Everything proceeded with bureaucratic calm, as if it were just any ordinary transaction, and not an act that was overturning the life of an entire family. Dante, leaning against the wall, watched with wide eyes as his father signed the papers. That left him without a home, without money, without a future. He felt he should do something, say something, stop this madness somehow, but he couldn't move. His feet seemed glued to the floor and his tongue to the roof of his mouth. He could only watch as his lung crumbled. First document, Jada read. Sales contract for the house at 14 Pendleton Street, apartment 73. Buyer, Sterling Vance, entrepreneur. Prepared to close the purchase within 1 week following the signing of this preliminary contract. Transaction amount, $80,000. Brianna let out a moan that sounded like the whimper of a wounded animal. $80,000. The house she had lived in for 15 years, the one she considered hers, was worth $80,000. And all that money was slipping through her fingers right before her eyes. "Wait," Dante said, finally pushing off the wall and taking a step forward. "Wait, please, Dad. Let's talk calmly. Without lawyers, without outsiders. We're family." Elias raised his head and looked at him. In his eyes, there was no rage or a desire for revenge, only the infinite sadness of someone who has been waiting for words for years that never came. "Family," he repeated, savoring the word. "Today in the kitchen, you told me to shut my mouth. You hit me in the face." Brianna laughed. "That is what you call family." "I went too far," Dante said, his voice breaking. "I was terrible, I know. But that's no reason to destroy everything we've built over so many years. Dad, I'm asking you, give me another chance, I promise. I'm going to change." Elias remained silent, looking at him. In that silence, there was something heavy, like a rock, at the bottom of a river. He remembered perfectly by all the times Dante had promised to change. After the first time he yelled at him in front of guests, after forgetting his birthday 3 years in a row, after calling him a burden in a conversation with Brianna, thinking he couldn't hear. "How many times have you asked for another chance, son?" he finally asked. "I've lost count. And every time I believed you because I wanted to believe you, because you were my son, my blood. I have loved you more than anything in this world." He stood up and approached Dante, stopping a step away from him. Father and son stood face to face, separated by a chasm of 15 years of unsaid reproaches and unshed tears. "But today you crossed a line," Elias continued, "and not just because you hit me. The blow is only a consequence. What broke me was seeing the contempt in your eyes, the contempt for the man who gave you life, and I realized I had been fooling myself." "Dad," Dante whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "Dad, please." Brianna stepped in, pushing him aside. With her shoulder, her face was contorted with a mixture of fear and awe. "You have no right," she spat. "We've spent 15 years taking care of you, putting up with your illnesses, your complaints, your constant presence in our house. We deserve this house. You owe it to us." Jada raised an eyebrow but kept quiet. The assistant took a step back, trying to disappear. Elias looked at his daughter Lorraine, and in his expression, there was neither hate nor contempt. There was something resembling pity. "Taking care of me," Elias repeated. "Brianna, in 15 years, you haven't even brought me a glass of water when I was sick. You never asked how I felt. You never said a kind word to me. You smoked right in front of me knowing I have asthma. You called me a stinking old man behind my back. You talked to your friends about when I would finally die just so you could have my room." Brianna opened her mouth to protest, but Elias raised his hand to stop her. "I heard everything," he said. "The walls here are thin, and despite what you believe, I still hear quite well. I heard every single thing you said about me. And I stayed silent because I had hoped that you'd get over it, that you'd eventually get used to me, accept me as part of the family. It wasn't like that, and it never will be." Brianna turned to Dante, looking for support. "Dante, say something. He's your father. Talk to him." Dante raised his head and looked at her, and in his eyes flashed something new, a bitter lucidity. "What do you want me to say?" he replied in a low voice. "That he's not right." "But he's right, Brianna. About everything. He looked back at Elias. I didn't know you heard everything, he admitted. I thought you locked yourself in your room and didn't notice anything. I thought. He stopped, unable to continue. Elias nodded slowly. You thought I was a senile old man who doesn't notice anything anymore, he said. That hurts too, son. It hurts. A lot. Jada cleared her throat again gently. Mr. Thistleton, if you'd like, we can take a break. No breaks, he said firmly. Let's continue. He went back to the bed, took the first document, and reviewed every line, every figure, every word. Then, he grabbed the pen and signed at the bottom of the page, with a clear, firm hand, without hesitation. Brianna stifled a scream as if that signature had caused her physical pain. No, you can't, she sobbed. And this is our house. She lunged toward the bed, trying to snatch the paper, but the notary's assistant was faster. He caught her hand gently, but firmly, and moved her away. Please calm down, he said. Any pressure or aggression toward the participants can be considered coercion and have legal consequences. Brianna pulled her hand away with a jerk and stepped back, breathing heavily. Their eyes were throwing sparks, but she kept silent, aware that the game was lost. Elias signed the second document, then the third. The notary stamped her seal on each sheet, and the dull thud of the stamp on the paper echoed in the room like a hammer blow. Dante remained motionless, watching as his father's signatures took away his house, his money, his comforts. He knew he should intervene, say something, but he couldn't. He simply watched as his life fell apart. Last document, Jada announced, placing another paper in front of Elias, a request for a change of address. As of today, you will be registered at the apartment on Broad Street, number 8, apartment 42. Elias signed that one, too. Done, he said, setting the pen down. It's over. He stood up and looked at his son and daughter-in-law. They stood side by side, but a rift seemed to have opened between them. Brianna looked at Dante with reproach, as if it were all his fault. Dante looked at the floor, unable to raise his eyes. You have 30 days, Elias said. Find another place and go. The buyer is willing to wait that long. Dad, Dante whispered. Where are we going to go? We don't have the money to rent anything decent. We haven't saved. We won't be able to woo. His voice broke. Elias looked at him and something like pity stirred in his chest. After all, he was still his son, the boy he had rocked in his arms, to whom he had sung lullabies, whom he had taught to ride a bike. But that boy had been lost a long time ago. You're a grown man, Dante, he finally said. It's time you learned to solve your own problems. Have been doing it for you for far too long. He turned to the notary. Thank you, Attorney Kensington. I appreciate your help very much. Jada gathered the documents, placed them in the folder, and stood up. That's what we're here for, she replied. If you need anything else, you know where to find me. She headed for the door, and her assistant followed. Before leaving the room, she stopped and looked at Elias. You've done the right thing, she told him in a low voice meant only for him. Don't doubt it. Elias nodded and she left. The front door closed and the house fell silent again. Brianna was the first to speak. She turned to Dante, her face contorted with rage. This is all your fault, she spat. Because of your little macho performance in the kitchen. If you hadn't hit him, none of this would have happened. We've lost everything. Because of you. Dante raised his head and looked at her. In his eyes was something new, a painful clarity. Because of me, he repeated slowly. Yes, surely because of me. But you laughed too, Brianna. You said it was time to put him in his place. You were glad when I hit my father. She opened her mouth to reply, but found no words. She stood there in the middle of the room, opening and closing her mouth, like a fish out of water. Elias looked at them with a strange expression, a mix of sadness and relief. Finally he saw his son exactly as he was, a weak man who had allowed his wife to run his life. A coward who hadn't been able to defend his own father, but also someone in whom, despite everything, a shred of conscience remained. Dante Elias said in a softer voice, I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing it because I have no other way out. If I stay here, you'll keep treating me the same way. You'll yell at me. You'll insult me. Maybe you'll hit me again. And one day my heart won't take it. He paused and looked him in the eye. I want to live, son. I'm 68 years old, but I'm not ready to die yet. And to live, I have to leave here. It's the only way. Dante listened, and his face changed. The rage and offense gave way to something else. a hard, unpleasant understanding. "Do you really think I could hit you again?" he whispered. Elias didn't answer, and his silence weighed more than any word. Brianna snorted in contempt. "Enough with the drama, Dante. Let's go. We don't have to endure this crazy old man humiliating us. He's going to regret what he's doing." She turned around and marched out of the room, her heels clicking loudly. After a few seconds, a bang was heard from the bedroom. She had thrown something against the wall. Dante didn't move. He kept looking at his father with tears glistening in his eyes. "Dad," he said with a trembling voice, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I've acted like a wretch all these years, but I want you to know something. In my own weird, twisted way I loved you. I just didn't know how to show it." Elias looked at him in silence and then stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, son," he replied softly. "I love you, too. It's exactly why it hurts so much." They stayed like that for a few seconds, joined by physical contact and separated by an abyss. Then Elias withdrew his hand and stepped back. "You have a decision to make, Dante," he said. "What kind of life do you want, and who do you want to live it with? I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're an adult, but think about it carefully. What happened today can be a turning point, or it can change nothing at all. You decide." Dante nodded, unable to speak. He turned around and left the room, leaving his father alone. Elias went back to the window. Outside, the streetlights were already on, their yellow light reflecting in the puddles on the asphalt. He felt empty, as if all the air had been sucked out of him. What had been accumulating inside him for 15 years had finally come out, and now he didn't know what to do with this kind of internal void. On the nightstand sat Dr. Nia Sterling's card. Elias took it and looked at the name, the well-defined letters. Then he took out his phone and dialed the number. The next morning dawned cold and clear, as if the world wanted to give Elias a sign that he had made the right decision. Sunlight flooded his small room with a golden glow, and dust motes danced in the air like tiny ballerinas on an invisible stage. He woke up early before 6 and lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence of the house. And on the other side of the wall, everything was quiet. Normally at this hour, Brianna was already making noise in the kitchen and shouting into her phone at her friends without worrying about waking anyone. But that day, nothing was heard. It felt as if the entire house had been emptied, as if what happened the day before had sucked all the life out of the place. Elias got up slowly, overcoming the slight dizziness that still reminded him of the heart attack. The doctor had recommended rest and no stress, but he knew this would be one of the most difficult days of his life. The day he would walk through the door of that house for the last time. He opened the closet and pulled out an old suitcase, the same one he and Loretta had taken on their honeymoon 45 years ago. It was worn and faded, but it was still sturdy, just like him, having survived so much and still standing. He opened it and began packing his things, carefully choosing what he wanted to take into his new life. The first thing he did was take Loretta's photo down from the wall and wrap it very carefully in a soft sweater so it wouldn't break. During the move, Loretta looked at him from the image with her loving eyes, and Elias felt she's nodding as if saying, "Finally, you dare. Finally, you're doing what you should have done years ago." Then he folded a few shirts, a couple of pairs of pants, a coat, and the thick sweater Loretta had knitted for him shortly before she died. He only wore that sweater on special days when he wanted to feel her close. That day was one of them. At the bottom of the suitcase, he placed a book, a volume of poems his father had read to him as a child. That book had been passed down from generation to generation, and Elias had dreamed many times of giving it to his son so he could give it to his own. Now he understood that plan no longer made sense. The chain had broken along the way, and it wasn't only Dante's fault. He packed the suitcase slowly without haste, as if performing an important ritual. Every object he touched carried a memory, people, place, moments that had made him who he was. He was saying goodbye to all of them, deciding which ones would accompany him and which would be left behind. When he finished, he sat on the bed and took out his phone. The night before, he had talked for a long time with Dr. Nia Sterling, the one from the ambulance. The call had been unexpectedly warm, as if they had known each other forever. She told him she had been widowed 3 years ago, that her husband died of cancer, and she still hadn't gotten used to the silence of her apartment. He told her about Loretta, about Dante, and about those 15 years of loneliness living among people who were supposed to be his family. They agreed that Nia would stop by to help him with the move. She had the day off, and said it would do her good to spend it on something useful. Elias accepted, although he had never liked receiving help from strangers. But Nia didn't seem like a stranger. He felt in some strange way that they had found each other. After a long time, someone knocked softly on the bedroom door, and Elias started. In 15 years, no one had knocked before entering. Normally, they burst in without warning, as if he weren't a person, but a piece of furniture with no right to privacy. "Come in," he said, his voice a bit raspy. The door opened and Dante appeared. He looked like to someone who hadn't slept all night. Dark circles under his eyes, messy hair, stubble. He stood in the threshold, not daring to come all the way in, and looked at his father, the half-empty room, the packed suitcase. "Are you really leaving?" he asked in a low voice. "I really am," Elias replied. "I already called a tea. It'll be here in an hour." Dante nodded and again went quiet. The silence between them grew thick, loaded with all the words that hadn't been said in 15 years, with all those that had never managed to leave their mouths. Dad, Dante finally broke the silence. "I was thinking all night about what you said yesterday, about how I have treated you all these years, and I realized." He stopped, searching for words, and Elias waited patiently, without rushing him. "I realized you were right," Dante finally continued. "In everything, I've acted like a beast. I let Brianna humiliate you. I humiliated you myself. I saw you as a burden when you never were. He did everything for us, and his voice cracked. He covered his face with his hands and his shoulders began to shake in a silent sob. Suddenly, Elias wasn't seeing a 42-year-old man, but the little boy who fell off his bike and scraped his knees, crying inconsolably. The boy he used to pick up in his arms to comfort and tell him everything would be all right. But this time, he couldn't comfort him the same way. Too much water had flowed under the bridge since then. Too many things had been broken. "Dante," Elias said gently. Dante raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked broken, as if he had just discovered that his entire life was built on a lie. "I'm not leaving to get revenge," Elias explained. "I'm leaving to survive, to stop enduring humiliations and waiting for death, but to truly live. I'm 68 years old, but I'm not a finished old man yet. I have strength, I have means, I have a desire to be happy, and I have the right to that." "I know," Dante whispered. "I understand." Elias stood up and approached him. He put a hand on his shoulder and spoke slowly but firmly. "You are my son, Dante. I loved you from the first moment I held you in my arms at the hospital. I loved you when you took your first steps. I loved you when you brought home your first bad grade from school. I loved you even when you were hurting me. That affection is not going to disappear. It will stay with me until my last day." He paused and looked him in the eye. "But loving someone doesn't mean putting up with everything. It doesn't mean giving up your dignity, your health, your life, for people who don't value that sacrifice. For years, I confused love with self-destruction. No more." And Dante listened to him and nodded slowly, as if each word were clicking into place inside him. "What do I do now, Dan?" he finally asked. "How am I supposed to move on?" Elias sighed and looked out the window. The yard was bathed in early morning sun. "I can't tell you that, son," he replied. "You're 42 years old. It's about time you made your own decisions and faced their consequences. But if you want on a piece of advice," he turned back to him, "think about what kind of life you want and who you want to live it with. Brianna isn't a bad person at her core, but with you, she brings out your worst. By her side, you become someone you don't want to be. And I'm not telling you to leave her. That decision is yours. But ask yourself if you're happy, truly happy, not just used to it." Dante remained silent, and Elias knew from that silence what the answer was. No, he wasn't happy. He had probably gone years without being so, but he didn't dare admit it, even to himself. Footsteps came from the hall, and Brianna appeared in the doorway. She was dressed and made up as if she were going out, and on her face was the usual frozen contempt. "What are you doing here?" she snapped toward Dante. "Why are you coming here to humiliate yourself in front of him? He's throwing us out on the street, and you're here whimpering like a child." Dante stood up slowly and looked at her. In his eyes shone that new firmness Elias had never seen in him. "I'm talking to my father," he said calmly, but with a tone that admitted no reply. "And that isn't lowering myself. That's called being a son." Brianna opened her mouth to protest, but Dante raised his hand to cut her off. "Wait for me in our room," he ordered. "We have many things to talk about." Brianna looked at him as if she didn't recognize him, then snorted in contempt and walked away. her heels striking the floor. Dante turned back to Elias and offered a sad smile. "First step," he said. "A tiny one, but a step nonetheless." Elias nodded and felt something warm opening in his chest. It was hope. Small, fragile, but hope that his son could still know change. At that moment, his phone rang. Elias looked at the screen. An unknown number, though he guessed who it was. "Yes," he answered. "Mr. Thistleton, it's Nia." The doctor's soft voice sounded. "I'm already downstairs at the building entrance. The Tagia has also arrived. Are you ready?" Elias looked at the suitcase, the almost empty walls, his son standing by. The door. "Yes," he said. "I'm ready. I'll be down in 5 minutes." He hung up and picked up the suitcase. Dante stepped forward and took it from his hand, without saying anything, as if he wanted to help in some way, however small, to make up for a part of what he had done. They left the room and walked down the hall toward the front door. Elias walked, slowly, looking one last time at that house where he had spent 15 years, the kitchen where he had cooked for a family that didn't value him, the living room where he sat in a corner while the others watched TV, pretending he didn't exist, the hallway. He had walked thousands of times, trying not to be a nuisance. He knew he wouldn't miss that place for a single second. By the door, he stopped and turned to Dante. Father and son stood face to face. The abyss between them was no longer as deep as the day before. It still existed, but between the two shores, a bridge was beginning to take shape. Flimsy, unstable, but a bridge, Dad. Dante stammered, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to say. Forgive me for everything." Elias looked at him for a long time and then did something he hadn't done in years. He hugged him. He hugged him tightly. That father's hug that calms childhood fears. Dante went rigid for a moment and then hugged him back, and his shoulders shook again in a silent sob. "A son isn't just someone who is born," Elias whispered into his ear. "A son is someone who tries to be one. Try to be that son, Dante. It's not too late yet." He pulled away slowly and took an envelope from his coat pocket. He laid it on the small shelf by the door. "Here is the notary's address and some documents," he said. "I've left you exactly the same amount of affection you gave me in these years." Dante looked at the envelope, but didn't pick it up. He guessed what was inside and was afraid to check. Elias opened the door and stepped out onto the landing. Before heading down, he turned one last time. "Goodbye, son," he said. "Or maybe, see you later. That's up to you." He began walking down the stairs. His footsteps echoed in the stairwell. With every step, he felt something very heavy falling from his shoulders, as if the air were becoming lighter, as if his chest were opening up and breathing were becoming easier. Down at the entrance, Nia was waiting for him. She stood next to a yellow taxi, smiling. Her smile was warm and sincere, like the sun flooding the courtyard. She wore a simple beige coat and a light scarf, and in Elias's eyes, she looked exactly how a woman looks when you want to spend the rest of your life with her. Elias stepped out of the building and paused for a moment, looking at her. She took a step toward him and took his hand naturally as if she had done it 1,000 times. "Ready?" she asked. Elias looked at the building where he had spent 15 years. The third-floor windows where all his past remained. The window of the neighbor across the way, Mrs. Gable, who was waving goodbye. "Ready," he replied, smiling. They got into the tea and the car pulled away. Elias looked out the window at the passing streets, the people walking fast, the bare trees waiting for winter, and he felt something strange, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt alive. Nia sat beside him holding his hand. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanations. She was simply there, and that was enough. "You know," Elias said without looking away from the window, "I'm 68 years old. Many people my age think their life is already over, that only illness, loneliness, and death await them." He turned to her. "I think they're wrong. I think life can start at any age. You just have to dare to take the first step." Nia smiled and squeezed his hand. "Home?" she asked. Elias nodded. "Home." The taxi pulled away from his past and carried him toward a future he had chosen. And for the first time in many years, Elias was truly smiling. He was smiling like someone who has finally found his freedom. Back in the third-floor apartment, Dante was standing by the window, watching the taxi disappear down the street. He held the envelope his father had left in the entryway. He didn't dare open it yet. Finally, he tore the seal carefully and looked inside. There was a sheet of paper and something else, something small and hard, wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped the cloth and found his father's broken glasses, the same ones that had shattered when he hit him in the kitchen. On the sheet, there were only a few lines written by hand. "This is all you left me in 15 years. Broken glasses and a broken heart, but a heart can still be mended. Try, son, it's not too late yet." Dante stood for a long time looking out the window with the broken glasses and the note in his hand. Tears ran down his face, and he didn't even bother to wipe them away. He thought about who he had been and who he wanted to be, about what he had lost and what he could still recover. Behind him, a door slammed. Brianna was leaving, slamming the door harder than usual. She said something, but Dante didn't hear her. He only heard his father's voice echoing in his head. A son isn't just someone who is born. A son is someone who tries to be one, and he understood that he still had a chance. Small, fragile, but a chance to become the son he should have been from the beginning. He turned away from the window and headed for the door. He had many things to do, much to change, much to repair. But the first step had already been taken, the most difficult and the most important, recognizing that he had been wrong. Dear viewers, thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Elias's story isn't just about money or properties. It's the story of someone who understands that it's never too late to change your life, to choose your own dignity over the fear of loneliness. It's the story that love doesn't mean enduring humiliations, and that true family doesn't always coincide with blood, but with those who treat you with respect and affection. What do you think? Do you believe Dante will be capable of changing after his father's departure, or will he go back to being the same as always? I would love to read your opinions in the comments. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about something important in your own life, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Every like and every comment helps the channel grow and allows us to bring you more stories like this one. Thank you for being there, and we'll see you in the next.
Thank you.